They weren't looking for it. That was the first thing everyone agreed on later. The trail they were following had faded into little more than a suggestion: flattened grass, a few broken branches, the kind of path made by animals or people who didn't want to be followed. When the trees finally opened, the cabin was already there, crouched low against the slope, its roof sagging under decades of rot and rain. It looked less like something built and more like something that had grown out of the mountain, wood darkened to the color of old blood, windows blind with grime. The air around it felt wrong. Not dangerous, exactly, just heavy, as if the forest itself had been holding its breath. No birds. No insects. Even the wind seemed to avoid the clearing. One of the hikers later said it felt like arriving somewhere long after a tragedy had already happened, when all that remained was the memory of it clinging to the walls. The door wasn't locked. It never had been. Inside, the smell told a story before anything else could: damp wood, ash, and something faintly human that shouldn't have lingered so long. The room was small, almost claustrophobic, yet every inch of it had been used. Shelves carved directly into the walls held jars of rainwater, dried roots, brittle scraps of cloth sewn and re-sewn until they barely resembled clothing. There was a bed in the corner, its mattress collapsed into a permanent hollow, like it had memorized the shape of a single body and refused to forget it. Then they saw the markings. Lines carved into the wall, stacked in uneven columns. At first glance, they looked like idle scratches, the kind left by boredom. But someone counted them. Someone kept counting when it stopped being comfortable. The math was simple and unbearable. Enough marks to suggest a person had slept there, woken there, and survived there for more than 60 years alone. No photographs. No radio. No calendar. Time had been measured differently in that cabin, not by dates but by endurance. By winters survived. By nights endured. Whatever life had been lived there hadn't been recorded for remembrance. It had been recorded to make sure it was real. And somewhere deep in the trees, far beyond the reach of trails or voices, the mountains stood the way they always had: silent witnesses to a life that disappeared without ever truly leaving. The discovery began as a mistake, the kind that happens when confidence quietly slips into carelessness. The hikers believed they were still following the outer curve of a maintained trail, but the forest had already begun to correct them. The ground changed first, softening underfoot, swallowing the familiar crunch of gravel and replacing it with wet leaves and roots that twisted like knuckles through the soil. The markers vanished without ceremony. No sign announced they were lost. The mountains rarely bother with warnings. They simply allow you to continue walking until the world no longer resembles what you recognize. They noticed the silence before anything else. It wasn't absolute, but it was selective, as if certain sounds had been removed on purpose. Birds appeared in the trees but did not call. Wind moved through the canopy without reaching the forest floor. Even their own voices felt smaller, dampened, absorbed too quickly by the dense growth pressing in from every side. It was the kind of quiet that made people lower their voices without knowing why. The cabin revealed itself slowly, not as an object but as a shape interrupting the natural order. Straight lines where none should exist. A roofline cutting across the organic chaos of branches. At first, it looked abandoned in the way old stumps sometimes resemble buildings, but the closer they moved, the clearer it became that this was not a trick of the light or the imagination. The structure was real, solid, and deliberate, set back against the slope as if trying to hide its own existence. What unsettled them most was not the condition of the cabin but its location. This far into the Appalachians, there should have been records, at least a whisper in park documentation or local law. Yet none of them had ever seen it marked on a map, digital or paper. There were no access roads, no cut paths leading toward it, no signs of recent travel. The forest around it had grown thick and unbothered, suggesting that whatever human presence had once existed here had not disturbed the land in a very long time. The cabin did not look collapsed or forgotten in the usual way. Its walls leaned but held. The roof sagged but remained intact. Someone had maintained it long past the point where most people would have surrendered to decay. That realization settled uneasily among the group, because it suggested intention rather than neglect. This wasn't a place people passed through. It was a place someone stayed. When they reached the clearing, None of them stepped forward immediately. The space felt claimed, not by ownership but by memory, like the aftermath of a life that had ended but refused to loosen its grip, the kind of place that made you feel observed without offering any proof, the kind of place that existed because it had been needed and then never let go. Crossing the threshold of the cabin felt less like entering a building and more like intruding into a sealed moment in time. The door opened with a long, dry groan, its hinges protesting the sudden reminder that the outside world still existed. Dust did not rush outward as expected. Instead, the air inside felt preserved, heavy and damp, as if it had been holding on to its secrets for decades. The light that slipped through the doorway moved slowly across the floor, revealing a space that was neither abandoned nor modern, but suspended somewhere in between. What struck them immediately was what wasn't there. No plastic. No wires. No batteries, screens, or manufactured conveniences that had crept into even the most remote corners of the country. Everything inside the cabin belonged to an earlier era, not preserved as a collection but worn through constant use. The furniture had been shaped by hand, joints uneven yet sturdy, surfaces polished smooth by years of contact. A small table near the wall bore deep grooves from repeated cutting, each mark layered over the last until the wood itself seemed exhausted. Shelves lined the walls, holding jars of cloudy liquid, dried herbs, and bundles of roots tied with twine that had darkened with age. Each item was placed with careful intent, not the careless clutter of a squatter but the methodical arrangement of someone who depended entirely on what the cabin could offer. There were tools made from salvaged metal and stone, sharpened repeatedly until their original shapes were almost gone. Every object carried evidence of repair, of being made to last long after it should have failed. The sleeping area was little more than a narrow bed pushed into the corner, its mattress sunken into a permanent hollow. The fabric was patched so many times that it no longer resembled a single material, just layers stitched together to keep the cold out. Nearby, folded clothing sat stacked with unnatural precision, each piece frayed, faded, and altered to extend its usefulness. Sizes had been adjusted repeatedly, suggesting the body that wore them had changed over the years, growing thinner, smaller, more careful with space. There were no personal mementos. No photographs. No letters. Nothing that tied the inhabitant to another person or a place beyond the trees outside. Even mirrors were absent, as if the person who lived here had slowly erased the need to recognize themselves. The absence felt deliberate, almost disciplined, as though modern life had not been lost to isolation but actively refused. What remained was a portrait of endurance stripped down to necessity, a life reduced to function, survival, and repetition, shaped by time rather than measured by it. It took time before anyone understood what the markings meant. At first they blended into the walls, faint lines carved into the wood where hands had brushed past them for years. They weren't neat or evenly spaced, and that irregularity made them easy to dismiss as idle scratches or the result of restless fingers. Only when someone followed them from one end of the cabin to the other did the pattern begin to emerge, stretching along the walls in uneven columns that stopped and started without obvious order. When the counting began, it was done half as a joke, half as a way to steady nerves. But the humor drained quickly. The lines weren't random. They were deliberate, each one cut with care, deep enough to survive decades of humidity and rot. Some were darker, freshly recut long after the others had faded, as if the person who made them had returned again and again to reinforce their existence. This wasn't decoration. It was record-keeping. As the numbers grew, so did the weight of the realization. The marks did not represent days in the casual sense. There were too many for that, and too few for hours or minutes. When someone suggested they might represent nights, the room went quiet. The idea settled heavily, reshaping everything around it. Nights made more sense here. Nights were what someone alone in the mountains would endure most consciously. Nights were what stretched the longest. The spacing told another story. Some lines were carved close together, suggesting periods of urgency or heightened awareness. Others were separated by wider gaps, as if time itself had thinned or blurred. There were clusters where the marks grew shallow and uneven, possibly carved by a trembling hand, possibly made during illness or injury. Then, inexplicably, they would regain their depth, cut with renewed strength, as though survival itself had returned. One wall ended abruptly, the markings stopping where the wood had been replaced years later. On the newer planks, the lines resumed, cut carefully to align with the old sequence. That continuity erased any lingering doubt. Whoever lived here had not simply passed through. They had stayed, long enough to outlast the cabin's original walls. Long enough to rebuild parts of it and continue counting as if stopping would mean something worse than death. When the final tally was estimated, the number felt unreal. More than 6 decades of marks stared back at them from the walls, a silent confession carved into rotting wood. No calendars. No clocks. Just repetition, endurance, and the slow measurement of a life lived in isolation. The markings transformed the cabin from a shelter into a witness, preserving proof that someone had existed here continuously, deliberately, and alone, marking time not because they expected rescue, but because forgetting would have meant disappearing entirely. The cellar was not immediately visible, which felt intentional in a way that made the discovery unsettling rather than surprising. It was hidden beneath a section of the floor that looked no different from the rest, the planks worn smooth and darkened by age. Only when one board shifted underfoot did the hollow sound rise up, dull and unmistakable. Beneath it was a rough wooden latch, worn thin from repeated handling, suggesting the space below had been used often, not forgotten. When the hatch was lifted, the air that rose from the opening carried a sharper scent than the rest of the cabin, metallic and stale, layered over damp earth. The light from above struggled to reach the bottom, revealing a narrow set of steps carved unevenly into the dirt. The walls were reinforced with scrap wood and stone, stacked with care but not comfort. This was not a place built for storage alone. It was a place meant to be returned to. At the bottom, they found a crude table stained dark in places where the wood had absorbed more than moisture. On it lay tools that immediately defied innocent explanation. Bent nails filed into points. Blades sharpened beyond practicality. Strips of leather used as bindings. Each item bore signs of repeated cleaning, not to preserve them but to make them usable again. This was not the clutter of hoarding. It was the order of necessity. Against one wall, shelves held jars filled with cloudy liquids, some containing fragments that were difficult to identify. Cloth bandages were folded nearby, stiff with old residue. The fabric had been washed and reused until it had thinned into near transparency. There was no sign of antiseptic, no modern medicine, only what could be scavenged or improvised. It suggested a person who treated injuries not to heal completely, but to survive them just enough to continue. More disturbing were the marks on the cellar walls. They were different from the ones upstairs, not tallies but smears and gouges made at shoulder height and lower. Some were shallow scratches, others deep furrows, as if someone had braced themselves there during moments of pain. The dirt floor bore irregular depressions that did not match footsteps, as though knees or elbows had pressed into the ground repeatedly in the same spots. There was no sign that anyone else had ever entered the cellar. No footprints layered over one another. No evidence of assistance or care beyond what one person could provide themselves. The space spoke of isolation at its most physical, where suffering had not been shared or witnessed, only endured in silence. Whatever injuries had occurred here were not accidents in the usual sense. They were consequences of a life lived alone, without safety, without relief, and without anyone to decide when pain should stop. The newspapers were found bundled together in a wooden crate tucked beneath the bed, wrapped in oilcloth that had long since lost its ability to keep moisture out. Most of them had fused at the edges, pages swollen and brittle, ink bleeding into itself until headlines became shadows of words rather than sentences. What remained legible belonged to another century, their dates clustered within a narrow span of years that ended abruptly, as if time itself had stopped arriving at the cabin. They were local papers, printed in small towns scattered along the lower ridges of the Appalachians. The names were unfamiliar to most people now, places bypassed by highways and slowly emptied as industries collapsed. The stories were ordinary weather reports, church socials, mine closures, but one pattern emerged as the pages were examined more closely. Certain sections had been folded and refolded until the creases threatened to tear through the paper entirely. The same column appeared again and again, preserved with a care not given to the rest. It was the missing persons notices. Short, factual entries, easy to overlook at first glance. One name, however, repeated itself across several weeks in the early 1950s, the description growing shorter each time, the hope implied by the language gradually replaced by resignation. The photograph, grainy and poorly reproduced, showed a person young enough to still believe their life extended far beyond the edges of the mountains. After a month, the notices stopped. The papers moved on. The town did too. What made the discovery unsettling was the location referenced in the articles. The disappearance had occurred within a day's walk of where the cabin stood, close enough that the person who lived there would have known the land intimately. The final article mentioned that search efforts had been scaled back due to difficult terrain and a lack of evidence, a decision framed as practical rather than tragic. The mountains, as always, were blamed. There were no later newspapers in the crate. No reports from the decades that followed. It suggested that whoever lived in the cabin had either stopped collecting them or stopped needing them. The absence of news mirrored the absence of contact with the outside world. Time had not continued here in the same way it did elsewhere. What lingered most was the realization that the disappearance was not a mystery to the person in the cabin. The careful preservation of those particular pages suggested memory rather than curiosity. The papers were not kept to remember a person lost, but to remember a moment when a life diverged from the rest of the world. A reminder of the last time they were seen, named, and searched for, before becoming someone who existed only in the margins of the forest, beyond the reach of towns, records, and concern. The recordings were discovered in a small tin box, hidden beneath the floorboards near the fireplace, the edges rusted through but the contents surprisingly intact. They were nothing like modern tapes or digital media, more akin to wax cylinders, fragile and heavy, with a surface that caught the light and reflected decades of dust. Handling them required care, a kind of reverence, as though even the slightest slip could erase voices that had already waited far too long to be heard. When played on a carefully restored phonograph, the sounds that emerged were unsettling in ways that no words alone could describe. At first, the recordings were mostly indistinct murmurs, the crackle of the needle exaggerating every sigh and cough. But beneath the static, a pattern emerged. A single voice, low and uneven, spoke in halting sentences, interrupted by long pauses that seemed to stretch across years. The tone was neither angry nor cheerful, but weary, deliberate, measured. It was the voice of someone who had spent decades speaking to no one but themselves, refining speech into a rhythm that could survive solitude. What was said was simple, almost banal at times, observations about the weather, notes on food, reminders of tasks, but the underlying fear became apparent as the recordings progressed. There were moments where the speaker's tone shifted, sharp and tense, a warning whispered to an invisible presence beyond the cabin walls. The voice referenced movement in the woods, strange noises, shadows that lingered too long, and the constant sensation of being watched. It was not paranoia born of loneliness alone, it was fear rooted in experience, in something the mountains had revealed and refused to relinquish. Some entries were marked by trembling syllables, the pauses longer and the words more fragmented. The speaker questioned themselves, their judgment, their sanity, yet the recordings carried the weight of someone trying to reason with what could not be reasoned. Occasionally, the voice seemed to address another person directly, though there was never a reply. It was unclear whether the other was imagined, a figment of desperation, or something real, a presence acknowledged in whispers, always beyond the reach of sight. The most chilling entries were those left near the end. The speaker spoke of choosing silence, avoiding contact with the world, and retreating further into the cabin as if the forest itself demanded obedience. The fear was no longer directed outward but inward, a recognition that survival meant surrendering everything else, including connection, identity, and time. Each word was a confession, a record of terror filtered through decades of isolation, and it left the listener feeling that the mountains had not simply sheltered this person, they had shaped, constrained, and broken them in ways that would remain incomprehensible to anyone who had not lived under that sky and among those shadows. The bones were discovered by accident, a half-buried fragment protruding from the slope behind the cabin, almost invisible beneath layers of leaf litter and moss. At first, they were assumed to be animal remains, perhaps the remnants of a deer or small livestock, long since scavenged and decayed. But as more fragments were uncovered, the shapes and densities began to betray the truth. The texture was different, the structure unmistakable in its human origin. Each piece told a story of careful burial, shallow enough to be hidden, deep enough to remain undisturbed, as though someone had taken the time to ensure the earth claimed them quietly. The bones were disarticulated, scattered in a way that suggested the body had been handled deliberately, not left to decay where it fell. The soil around them was compacted unevenly, evidence of repeated digging and replacement, a labor-intensive process performed over years rather than hours. It was not violence in the spontaneous sense but methodical, a form of management that reflected an understanding of what survival demanded, or perhaps an attempt to control death itself. There were no signs of tools beyond what might have been carried in the cabin, crude implements sufficient for the work, further reinforcing the sense that this was one person, alone, maintaining the earth around them as a form of private record. Analysis revealed more unsettling details. The bones bore signs of wear and minor injuries sustained over time. Fractures that had healed imperfectly, teeth worn unevenly, joints that had been strained or broken repeatedly, all indicating a life spent entirely without care or aid from others. The presence of certain marks, shallow but precise, suggested post-mortem intervention, the kind of careful attention that could only have been applied by someone intimately familiar with their own limitations and the tools at hand. It was as if the bones themselves were being catalogued, preserved in small ways, a final testament to a life lived and ended on the terms of its solitary occupant. No personal artifacts were buried alongside them, no clothing remnants, no jewelry, no identifiers, only the earth and the body itself. It was a stark contrast to the cabin, where every object had been arranged for efficiency and endurance. Here, the bones existed as a silent conclusion, a quiet record of mortality that required no annotation. They were left where they could be found by no one, yet arranged with a meticulousness that spoke of pride, ritual, or perhaps the compulsion to order what could not otherwise be controlled. For those who uncovered them, the discovery forced a reckoning. The person who had lived in the cabin for decades had endured more than mere isolation. They had faced injury, pain, and the slow disintegration of their own body without aid or witness, and they had chosen to manage even the final stages of life alone. The mountains, the cabin, and the hidden grave together painted a portrait of endurance and quiet obsession, a life measured not in years or days but in survival, secrecy, and the careful negotiation with forces no one else would see or understand. When the hikers returned to the nearest town to ask questions, they found a quiet, cautious reception. The locals spoke in careful sentences, glancing at one another before sharing details, as though certain knowledge had been drilled into their habits over generations. "Those mountains aren't for everyone," one elderly man said, voice low and deliberate. "Some things get left behind out there, and people just don't talk about them." His eyes flicked toward the ridges in the distance, where the forest darkened into the jagged folds of the Appalachians, as if the trees themselves might overhear. Stories, when they were told, were fragmented, more suggestion than fact. The cabin was mentioned only in whispers, referred to as a place where someone had been left behind on purpose. That phrase, repeated with slight variations, carried a weight that made the hikers shiver. No one offered explanations. No one claimed to know exactly why, or by whom, or for what crime or misfortune. The answer was unnecessary. The mere acknowledgement of the cabin's existence was enough to convey the danger of curiosity, the risk inherent in seeking it out. Some locals framed it as history, a cautionary tale about people who had vanished during earlier decades, their absence noted but never fully investigated. Others hinted at something more deliberate, a social contract between those who survived in the valleys and the wilderness itself. The mountains demanded compliance, isolation, and respect, and those who failed were quietly removed from the map, their fates absorbed into the folds of the land. Children were warned never to stray too far from trails, and hunters spoke of hearing strange noises where the forest grew too dense to navigate. There was a particular unease surrounding the idea of the cabin's occupant. Some claimed they had known someone who had been connected to it, vaguely remembered family members who had disappeared into the mountains, and then disappeared themselves. Each recollection was hedged with disclaimers: it was best not to pry, best not to ask too many questions, and certainly best not to attempt to locate the cabin. The forest did not welcome investigation. Those who tried were either discouraged by accident or misfortune, lost paths, sudden storms, rockslides, or by the subtle but persistent feeling that they were being watched. It became clear that knowledge of the cabin carried its own penalty. Silence was the rule, and outsiders were rarely trusted with the details. Even the fact that hikers had found the place was treated with a mixture of awe and dread. The mountains, it seemed, did not forgive curiosity lightly. People lived here and left here on the terms of the forest, and anyone who intruded might never understand what had happened until it was too late. In this way, the cabin existed as a secret embedded not just in the trees, but in the culture of those who lived at the edge of them, a place simultaneously feared, respected, and avoided, a testament to something that had been allowed to endure beyond the reach of law, memory, or explanation. The journal was found tucked beneath a loose floorboard, its cover cracked and edges frayed, the paper inside yellowed with age. Its pages were dense with writing, the script small and deliberate, the ink faded but still legible, each line pressing more heavily on the next, as if the act of recording demanded permanence. The entries began like any diary might, noting weather, food, and the practical details of survival, but gradually, a shift became apparent. The voice of the writer, at first observational, slowly turned inward, reflective, haunted by choices made decades earlier. The later pages revealed a chilling clarity about the life the cabin had contained. The writer described isolation not as circumstance, but as a decision, chosen deliberately to escape the outside world. Relationships had been abandoned, towns left behind, and every connection severed by intention. The words conveyed that this was not merely survival in solitude, but a kind of self-imposed penance. The forest had not trapped them, they had trapped themselves, building a life that could be measured only by endurance and the passing of days that were counted on carved walls and in solitary rituals. There were moments in the journal when fear was confessed openly, yet it was a fear not of the wilderness itself, but of what might emerge if the discipline of isolation faltered. The writer spoke of shadows in the forest, sounds in the night, and the persistent sense of being watched. At times, these references seemed like hallucinations born from solitude, yet they were always noted with careful observation, catalogued as though testing reality against memory and perception. Every day survived reinforced the necessity of staying within the cabin, maintaining control over the life they had chosen, and refusing the world beyond. Equally disturbing were entries reflecting the physical toll of decades alone. The writer chronicled injuries sustained in the forest, illnesses endured without aid, and the gradual deterioration of the body. Pain was acknowledged with meticulous detail, yet it was framed as another reason for continued isolation, another affirmation of the decision to remain in the cabin. Each hardship was reasoned, rationalized, and then folded back into the pattern of life that had been deliberately constructed, a life measured not by companionship or comfort, but by persistence and self-discipline. The final entries grew increasingly sparse, but every word was heavy with reflection. The writer confessed that the life they had led was a form of punishment, a deliberate choice to live stripped of human contact, of civilization, of connection. Isolation had not been refuge, it had been obligation, a lifelong penance exacted by choice and sustained by fear, by habit, and by an unshakable determination to remain in the mountains. The cabin, the walls, the hidden cellar, and the tallies on the wood all were part of this deliberate, terrible structure, a life not endured by accident, but lived deliberately, fully, and inescapably alone. After the cabin and its contents were documented, authorities moved quietly, almost as if the mountains themselves had requested discretion. A perimeter was established, and the area was cordoned off to prevent casual trespassers, but there was no public notice beyond a terse press statement describing the site as an abandoned structure of historical interest. The official narrative minimized everything the hikers and investigators had found inside. The tallies on the walls were described as marks from long-term occupancy, the bones attributed to animal remains, and the journals and recordings were simply catalogued as archival materials with little context. The care with which these statements avoided mention of human suffering, fear, or deliberate isolation suggested a deliberate flattening of reality into something palatable and bureaucratic. Those involved in the investigation noticed a strange consistency in the language used by local authorities and the larger agencies overseeing the site. Words like unknown, unverified, and preliminary appeared frequently, even when evidence had been carefully documented. The cabin's occupant, if human, was referred to only in hypothetical terms. Each report, each filing, subtly removed the person from the narrative, transforming decades of life, fear, and survival into an object lesson rather than a lived experience. To outsiders, the cabin became a relic rather than a home, a curiosity rather than a chronicle of endurance. Physical measures were taken as well. Certain artifacts, including the journals, recordings, and the more delicate tools, were removed for preservation, but much of the cabin was left to the forest, as if the mountains themselves had reclaimed authority over what remained. Planks were replaced or reinforced, but the markings on the walls and the subtle traces of long-term habitation were largely left in situ, though inaccessible to the public. The perception created was one of respect for history, but the underlying effect was containment. The story was managed. It existed, but it could not speak. Even among those who had uncovered the cabin firsthand, a sense of unease persisted. The official explanations conflicted sharply with what had been seen, measured, and recorded. The bones, the cellar, the meticulous household, and the journals all bore witness to a life that had been far more complex, harrowing, and deliberate than the sanitized reports suggested. Locals, too, sensed this. They had known for years that the mountains held their secrets tightly, and now they watched as the narrative was carefully curated to shield the broader world from understanding what had actually happened. In the end, the cabin was sealed in a way that allowed it to endure but kept its truths largely inaccessible. The official story provided closure without revealing the raw, unsettling reality. Those who visited, those who studied the site, and those who stumbled upon it later were left with fragments, artifacts, and hints, but not the full picture. The life lived alone for 60 years, the choices made in the shadow of the mountains, and the terrors endured within the walls of the cabin remained largely hidden, preserved in memory and whispers rather than in the records meant to contain them, a quiet testament to a story that the world was permitted to know only in part.